In a scene from the film My Fair Lady, as Eliza Doolittle is now come to Professor Henry Higgins to offer herself to be taught to speak properly as a proper Englishwoman, she says she's perfectly willing to pay for the lessons. When Professor Higgins asks her how much, she says, "Well, I won't give more than a shilling." To which Professor Higgins begins to think about what her contribution is as a percentage of her regular income. And he says, when you consider a shilling, not just an ordinary shilling, but as a percentage of her income, it comes out to around 50 or 60 pounds for a millionaire. And is delighted. He says it's the biggest offer he's ever had, because considering her income, a shilling is a lot of money. Of course, Eliza, not understanding what he's talking about, suddenly thinks he's going to charge her 50 or 60 pounds and descends into a Cockney tirade and panic because she doesn't have that kind of money. But Henry Higgins makes an interesting point, and a very similar point that Jesus makes in today's gospel when he compares the widow and her contribution with the contribution of the wealthy, who give from their surplus. They can afford to give from the extra wealth that they have, where she gives everything she has, and as such is honored more by Christ for her generosity. But this is one of these gospels that is hopefully very familiar to everybody. We have that proverbial widow's mite, the giving even from one's want. And it perhaps could be easy to say this is an example of giving to the poor and generosity in giving to the poor, until you realize that this widow is poor, as is the widow of the first gospel, of the first reading, who takes care of Elijah, the prophet, during a time of great drought and famine. On the other hand, it's easy to fall back and retreat behind the usual sentiment of, oh, she gave with love, they gave with love. And that's kind of a given, but it really isn't a point that's made here in the gospel. Then you realize who exactly and to what exactly are these widows contributing all they have? Well, in the case of the first reading, the widow is providing sustenance and support during a drought to a prophet of the Lord. And being a prophet was part of the institutional faith of Israel. And in fact, what leads to the drought is Israel's descending into paganism because of the reign of King Ahab and his wife, the notorious Jezebel, who brings the pagan worship of Baal to Israel. And Baal is actually, if you know ancient Canaanite mythology, a very good god, a savior god. The fact that child sacrifice was a part of his cult is a not so minor inconvenience to it, but Baal was the god of rain for a desert region. He rode on the storm over the sea in great thunder and a great storm. And if he makes it to shore, it was a time of plenty, a time of a great harvest, because rain has now been provided for a desert region. And if the storm is pushed back by the sea, then it's a time of drought and famine. And at this time, God has declared a drought. Why? To demonstrate that it is the God of Israel who provides the rain and not a pagan god called Baal. And so it's in the midst of this drought. Also, Jezebel, the queen, has put to death all of the legitimate prophets of God. And Elijah is the only one left. And the widow recognizes this. He's not just any man. He is part of an institution in the faith of Israel. And she herself, who's not a part of Israel, recognizes this and supports him in his ministry, in his work, in his calling as a prophet. And God, of course, rewards her, and he rewards her son. In the case of the gospel, who is the widow contributing to? Who is she giving the last of her money to? It's not the poor, because she herself is poor. She's giving to the temple treasury, along with the other wealthy donors. Now, perhaps there is also the expectation that as part of the institutional temple work and the faith of the people of Israel It is a very strong tenet and a very particular tenet of that faith that the people of Israel are to take particular care of 4 groups of people: the poor, the orphan, the foreigner, and the widow. And perhaps she is giving with an expectation that she would be taken care of by the ministry and work of the temple and by the people of Jerusalem and the surrounding areas, her being a widow. But she's not giving to the poor. She's giving to the institutions of her faith. So I hate to say it, but this is a collection gospel. They aren't giving to individuals. They're giving to the religious institutions founded by God himself. In the case of the widow in the first reading, the institution of prophecy, of God speaking his word through these men, a charism that God established in Israel, and she recognized that and supported Elijah as a prophet during a time of famine and drought. And the widow of the second reading is giving to the temple, an institution established by God in which, in that temple, God's glory shone forth and God's glory was present. But it wasn't just a matter of giving all she had out of generosity. It wasn't just a matter of the 2 of these widows giving out of love. They gave out of a very, very deep faith that they had in these institutions: the prophecy of God and the temple in Jerusalem. They had great faith in God being the one to establish these institutions and the work that these institutions would instigate throughout Israel. Not just a question of generosity, but a generosity born from a very deep faith. And it's a good lesson for all of us down to today. How often do people make the distinction when it comes to their generosity, assuming they're generous to begin with? They'll say, well, we prefer to give to people. We don't want to give to buildings. We don't want to give to institutions. Among my favorite is where people say, well, I'm religious. I just don't believe in organized religion. One would assume they believe in disorganized religion, but of course it's one of the cliches we hear people say, where they like to make the distinction between people and institutions in the church. And sometimes they're very eloquent with the reasons why they don't. I mean, even Jesus is critical of the administration of the temple, but he doesn't decry the temple itself as an institution. He criticizes the corruption of the priests within them and their lack of responsibility for the contributions that the people give and the responsibilities that they have to minister to the people and provide pure sacrifice as priests. But he praises the woman for her faith in that institution. In the same way, please keep priests and other administrators in your prayers of the church, as we're called to administer the contributions and the generosity that the people give in the collection and through other means of giving. But here we have an example in which faith also moves us to the support of these institutions, the church throughout the world, our local parish, our cathedral. Faith that this church has been established by God himself in and through Jesus Christ. And that despite our own human frailty and sinfulness, it's a church that has continued its work for millennia throughout the world and will continue to do so. And like the widows of both the first reading and the gospel, we're called to have that same faith, not just in God, but in the institutions that Jesus established to carry out his work throughout the world, to bring about further sanctification of the world until he comes again. And of course, the church, if I may speak for it, is tremendously grateful for the generosity of the good people of the church who have contributed to the institution in and through the collection at Mass and other means of donation to the church. And again, please pray for the priests, especially the pastors and other administrators who are tasked to administer that responsibly But let us also recognize the faith from which that generosity comes. Because we are called to live a life as people who follow Christ. But we're also called to put our faith in the institutions established by Christ, which is why one of the precepts of the church is contributing insofar as one can to the well-being of the church. The 5 precepts of the church: Mass on Sunday and holy days, communion at least during Easter, confession at least once a year, preferably during Lent, observing the days of fasting and abstinence, and the 5th precept is supporting insofar as one can the work of the church through financial means and otherwise. Ours is not a church that requires tithing, an obligatory 10%, like some churches do. We rely on the generosity of the people of God to support the work that the church does. And we are tremendously grateful for that generosity, because I would guess more often than not, it's a generosity that comes from a faith that is similar, if not exact, to the 2 widows we see in our readings today. Yes, it was very generous for those widows to do what they did. Obviously, it was done out of a great love. But it was also done by a deep faith in the institutions established by God. The institution of prophecy in Israel and the temple. And let us reflect that same generosity born from a deep faith for our institutional church, always praying for those who have the responsibility to administer that generosity, but always giving gratitude to God for that deep faith we have in Him and in the institutions He established to carry out His work throughout the world.